Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. Sarah ventured deep into the heart of an ancient, dense forest, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of decaying leaves beneath her. The twilight sky, streaked with fading shades of orange and purple, gave the woods an eerie glow. As she ventured deeper, an unsettling stillness enveloped her, the kind of oppressive silence that prickles the skin and raises the hairs on the back of the neck. Her heart began to beat faster, the quiet too heavy, too deliberate, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Armed only with a flashlight, Sarah aimed for a forgotten cabin rumored to be the haunt of a hermit who had vanished under mysterious circumstances decades ago. Legends whispered of the hermit's descent into madness, his obsession with occult rituals and dark spirits, and a cabin filled with odd, unnerving symbols that were said to be gateways to otherworldly realms. The path twisted further into the heart of the forest, where the trees loomed over her like silent sentinels of a long-forgotten kingdom. Suddenly, her flashlight flickered erratically, throwing shadows that danced like specters across the gnarled trunks. In the fleeting moments of darkness between the flashes of light, Sarah's eyes caught sight of something large and misshapen stalking her from the parallel path. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, as if it was both there and not there, phasing in and out of reality. Her breath caught in her throat as the air grew colder around her, and a low, resonant growl echoed through the trees. The sound was not of this world. It vibrated with a menacing promise of danger. Panic surged through her veins, and she quickened her pace, but the thick underbrush and gnarled roots seemed to conspire against her, grabbing at her ankles and slowing her escape. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but the forest seemed to close in around her, the trees bending ominously as if they were alive, watching her struggle with cold amusement. The creature, whatever it was, continued to shadow her, its growls growing louder and more desperate. As Sarah finally saw the silhouette of the cabin through the trees, her flashlight died completely, plunging her into darkness. The cabin's door, hanging crookedly on its hinges, creaked ominously. With nowhere else to go, she stumbled towards it, the growls behind her growing ever closer. As she crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped sharply, and the faint sound of chanting filled the air, the words not quite human. The cabin was cluttered with strange artifacts and symbols scrawled across the walls, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The floor was littered with old, brittle bones arranged in a circle. In the center, a dark tome lay open, as if waiting for her. Outside, the growls ceased suddenly, replaced by a deafening silence that was somehow more terrifying. As Sarah turned to close the door, a shadow loomed in the doorway, tall and imposing, its eyes glowing with a malevolent red light. She realized then that the cabin wasn't a refuge but a trap, one set by the very spirits the hermit had once sought to control. Now they were coming for her, and the night was just beginning. Story 2. The chill of the October evening settled into Kyle's bones as he hiked the rugged trails of the old pine forest. His flashlight swept over the dense undergrowth, casting eerie shadows among the gnarled trees. Stories of the forest being haunted by the spirit of a woodsman who was betrayed and murdered hundreds of years ago were often whispered in the town. They said his spirit was restless, cursed to wander the woods, seeking vengeance against any who dared tread too near his final resting place. As night deepened, the wind began to howl through the trees, a mournful, angry sound that seemed almost human. Kyle, determined to debunk these local legends, ventured deeper into the forest until he found the old woodsman's alleged haunt, a small clearing where the trees were strangely bent, as if in agony. He set up his small camp in the clearing, the fire he lit casting a flickering light that made the surrounding woods seem to move. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped and a dense fog rolled in, enveloping the clearing in a thick, ghostly blanket. Kyle's ears picked up a soft, sorrowful moan that seemed to echo from the depths of the forest. He convinced himself it was just the wind. Trying to shake off the unease, Kyle decided to explore the area with his flashlight in hand. As he wandered around the clearing, his light fell upon an old, rusty axe embedded in a tree stump. An axe that legend said was used to kill the woodsman. The handle was worn, the blade notched and stained with what looked disturbingly like old blood. As he reached out to touch it, the temperature dropped sharply, and the moaning grew louder, more desperate. Suddenly, the ground shook slightly under his feet, and the trees around the clearing began to rustle fiercely, though there was no wind. His heart racing, Kyle turned back to see a shadowy figure emerging from the fog. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that burned with a cold, malevolent light. The figure moved towards him slowly, dragging an axe similar to the one in the stump. Kyle, paralyzed with fear, watched as the figure raised its weapon, the moans turning into angry shouts. It was speaking in a language he couldn't understand, a chilling, guttural series of grunts and growls that froze his blood. Realizing the danger was real, and not just a figment of local folklore, Kyle turned and ran as fast as he could through the dense fog. He could hear the figure chasing him, the sound of the axe dragging along the ground, and its furious, haunted screams echoing through the trees. Kyle did not stop running until he burst out of the forest's edge, the lights of his small town visible in the distance. He never looked back, but the sounds of the woodsman's rage followed him all the way to the outskirts of the forest. Back home, Kyle locked himself in, his mind reeling from the terror he had experienced. He knew he had escaped with his life, but the haunted, vengeful eyes of the woodsman would haunt his dreams forever, a stark reminder that some legends are rooted in terrifying truths. Story 3. Mia and her brother Tom ventured into the dense heartwood forest, drawn by tales of an ancient creature said to reside within its darkest depths. As children, they'd heard whispers of the Heartwood Witch, a spectral figure wrapped in tattered robes, with hands that could twist the very trees to her will. Locals avoided the forest at dusk, fearing her curse that was rumored to turn wanderers into stone. Armed with just a map and their curiosity, Mia and Tom found themselves enveloped by the towering oaks and whispering pines as twilight approached. The deeper they walked, the more unnerving the forest became. Shadows twisted into menacing shapes, and the air grew thick with a palpable sense of watchfulness. Suddenly, Tom stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes were fixed on a figure shrouded in black, standing between two ancient oak trees. The figure was still, almost blending into the darkness, but there was no mistaking the malevolent presence they felt emanating from it. "Is that?" Tom's voice trembled as he pointed. "It has to be," Mia whispered back, her voice barely audible. They stood frozen, observing as the figure slowly raised its arms. The trees around it began to creak and groan, their branches bending unnaturally towards the ground, as if bowing in the presence of their master. Mia, feeling a surge of terror, grabbed Tom's arm. "We need to go now," she insisted, her instinct to flee kicking in. But as they turned to leave, a thick mist rolled in, surrounding them and obscuring their path. The air turned cold, biting into their skin, and the forest's noises fell silent, replaced by a low, haunting chant that seemed to come from everywhere. They stumbled through the underbrush, desperate to find their way back, but every direction seemed to lead them deeper into darkness. The chanting grew louder, and the ground beneath their feet began to feel soft, almost alive, as if it were moving and shifting with a mind of its own. Tom tripped over a root, falling to the ground with a grunt. Mia tried to help him up, but as she touched his arm, she recoiled in horror. His skin felt hard, like stone. "Tom," she screamed, looking into his eyes, which were wide with fear and confusion. Before her eyes, Tom's transformation accelerated. His features hardened, his movements stilled, and within moments he was a statue, an eerily accurate stone replica of her brother, frozen in an expression of terror. Mia, heart pounding and tears streaming down her face, knew she was next. The chanting intensified, and she felt her limbs growing stiff, her movements sluggish. In a last desperate attempt, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, hoping to capture proof of the witch's existence, or at least leave a clue for someone to find them. As her fingers turned to stone, the phone dropped, landing on the leaf-covered ground, its camera pointing up at her petrifying face. The last thing Mia saw before her vision faded was the figure of the Heartwood Witch approaching, her eyes glowing with a cruel satisfaction as she claimed another soul for her forest. Story 4. In the remote village of Elder's Hollow, locals spoke of the Midnight Caller, a phantom who roamed the misty fields at night, heralding doom with its eerie cries. Ellie, a young writer fascinated by ghost stories, decided to investigate these legends for a blog, despite the villagers' warnings to steer clear of the fields after dark. Armed with her camera and a small flashlight, Ellie ventured out as the clock struck midnight. The air was thick with fog, and the moon, a mere sliver in the sky, provided scant light. As she walked, the silence was oppressive, broken only by her footsteps on the dewy grass. Suddenly, a chilling wail pierced the night. Ellie spun around, her heart racing. She scanned the darkness with her flashlight, catching glimpses of a shadowy figure at the edge of her light's reach. It was tall, its form indistinct, wrapped in what appeared to be a cloak that fluttered in the windless night. Ellie, both terrified and thrilled, followed the figure as it moved slowly through the fields. Her camera clicked and whirred, capturing blurry images of the phantom. The wailing grew louder, more desperate, as if the ghost mourned an ancient, unspeakable loss. As she drew closer, the ground beneath her feet became soft, the grass slick with an unseasonable frost. The air grew colder, and her breath turned to mist. The figure stopped and turned, revealing not a face, but a hollow void beneath its hood, a darkness so deep it seemed to swallow the weak light of her flashlight. Paralyzed with fear, Ellie felt the cold seep into her bones. The phantom raised its arms, and the wail became a deafening scream that echoed across the fields, filling Ellie's ears with a sound so sorrowful it felt as though her heart might break. Just as she thought she might collapse from fright, the figure vanished, as if swallowed by the ground itself. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by the normal sounds of the night. Shivering and unsure if her encounter had been real or a trick of the fog, Ellie hurried back to the village, her camera full of what she hoped was evidence of her encounter. Back in her rented room, Ellie reviewed the photos. Each one showed the fields, the fog, and the indistinct figure of the Midnight Caller. But in the last photo, taken right before the phantom disappeared, there was something else. A face, pale and sorrowful, peering out from the darkness of the hood. Its eyes were filled with an eternal sadness, its mouth open in a silent plea. Ellie uploaded the photos to her blog, her hands trembling. She wrote about her experience, her words a mixture of fear and fascination. The post went viral, drawing the curious and the skeptical alike to Elder's Hollow. But Ellie couldn't shake the sadness she had seen in the ghost's eyes, and she knew she would never forget the sound of its mourning cries. Months later, long after the story had faded from public interest, Ellie would still wake at midnight to the echo of that wailing in her dreams. A haunting reminder of the night she met the midnight caller of Elder's Hollow. Story 5. Late one autumn evening, Mara ventured into the dense forest that bordered her small town, drawn by the tales of an ancient witch said to haunt the area. Her curiosity, fueled by the local lore, pushed her past the familiar, well-trodden paths into the deeper, darker parts of the woods, where the trees grew so close together, their branches intertwined, blocking out the moonlight. As she delved further, the air grew unnaturally cold, and a thick mist began to rise from the ground, swirling around her feet. The deeper she went, the more disoriented she became. The once familiar woods, now a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. The trees seemed to move, their gnarled branches clawing at her clothes as if warning her to turn back. Mara's heart pounded in her chest as she heard a soft, melodic humming that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. It was hauntingly beautiful, yet carried an underlying tone of sadness and despair. Following the sound, she came upon a clearing where the moonlight pierced through the dense canopy, illuminating a figure in the center. It was a woman, or what once had been a woman. Her long grey hair flowed around her like a cloak, and her skin was as pale as the moonlight itself. Her eyes, when they met Mara's, were a deep, sorrowful black, reflecting centuries of solitude and sorrow. The witch, for it could only be she, held a small, ancient book clutched to her chest, murmuring words that made the air shimmer with a spectral light. Mara, unable to move or speak, watched as the witch approached, her movements graceful, yet filled with a terrible purpose. She spoke in a voice that rustled like dead leaves. "You seek the knowledge of the ancients, the secrets buried beneath roots and earth. But are you willing to pay the price, child?" Before Mara could respond, the witch opened her book, and the pages fluttered rapidly, as if caught in a storm. The air around them thickened, and Mara felt her very soul being drawn towards the open tome. Images flashed before her eyes, ancient rituals, forgotten spells, faces of people long dead, and lands that time had forgotten. The witch's eyes bore into her a piercing gaze that promised eternal knowledge at the cost of an equally eternal servitude. Mara, realizing too late the trap she had walked into, tried to pull away, but the ground beneath her feet had turned to a marsh, holding her fast. With a desperate effort, Mara tore herself free, the witch's wail echoing through the trees as she fled. She ran without looking back, the witch's curses fading into the howl of the wind and the rustling of the leaves. When she finally emerged from the woods, the dawn was breaking, and the town had never seemed so welcoming. But even as she escaped with her life, Mara knew she had left something behind in that haunted clearing. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would hear the witch's humming, a mournful melody that seemed to call her back to the forest, and she knew, deep in her heart, that part of her would always remain there, caught in the pages of the ancient book, forever bound to the witch of the woods. Story 6. In the dead of winter, under a heavy grey sky, Ethan decided to explore the old Henderson property at the edge of town. Rumored to be cursed by the townsfolk, the dilapidated mansion, abandoned for decades, was the perfect setting for a haunting adventure. As he approached, the wind picked up, carrying whispers that seemed to speak his name, urging him forward. Pushing open the creaking gate, Ethan's breath formed clouds in the freezing air, and his footsteps echoed on the frost-hardened ground. The mansion loomed before him, its windows like dark, watching eyes, and the once grand door hanging off its hinges. Despite the daylight, shadows clung to the building, deep and dark, as if swallowing the weak winter sun. Ethan stepped inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper and dust-covered furniture. A grand staircase spiraled upwards, its banisters gnawed by time, As he ascended, the air grew colder, and the silence was broken only by the groan of old wood under his feet. Reaching the second floor, Ethan explored the rooms, each one draped in shadows and decay. In what appeared to be a child's bedroom, a broken doll lay on the floor, its glass eyes staring up at him, reflecting his torchlight. The atmosphere was suffocating, heavy with the scent of mold and something faintly metallic. Suddenly, the air shifted, growing denser, as if the house itself was breathing. Ethan turned, his flashlight beam falling on a mirror hanging askew on the wall. In its cracked surface, he caught a glimpse of movement behind him. Whirling around, he saw nothing but the empty room and the silent shadows. Heart pounding, Ethan faced the mirror again. This time, his own reflection was overshadowed by another figure, a pale, spectral child, standing where no child was. Its eyes were hollow, its expression twisted in a silent scream. As Ethan watched, paralyzed, the child reached out, its hand pressing against the glass, fingers streaking the dusty surface. Compelled by a terror he couldn't understand, Ethan stepped closer to the mirror. The air grew colder with each step, the edges of the mirror seeming to blur and darken, pulling him in. The child's mouth moved, and though no sound came, Ethan heard the words clear as a whisper in his mind. "Help me, free me." Overcome by a sudden, irrational fear that the child would pull him into the mirror, Ethan stumbled back, knocking into a chair. The room spun, and he fell, his head striking the wooden floor. When he looked up again, the mirror was just a mirror, cracked and silent. Scrambling to his feet, Ethan fled the room, the house seemingly groaning in protest as he ran. He didn't stop until he was out of the gate, the mansion receding into the background, silent and brooding. Back home, Ethan tried to convince himself it had been a trick of the light, his imagination fueled by the ghost stories surrounding the old Henderson place. But that night, as he lay in bed, the image of the spectral child haunted him, its hollow eyes and silent scream etched into his mind. And sometimes, in the stillness of the night, he would hear a whisper, soft as a sigh, the words repeating like a lament, "Help me, free me." And he knew the mansion held more than just old ghosts. It held a sorrow that was alive, waiting for someone brave enough to return and uncover its dark secrets. Story 7. On a foggy autumn evening, Clara ventured into the woods behind her grandmother's house, drawn by tales of an ancient tree said to whisper secrets to those who listened closely. The woods were thick with mist, the path obscured by fallen leaves and the gnarled roots of ancient trees. Each step Clara took was cautious, the silence around her thick enough to smother the sounds of the nearby town. As she delved deeper, the woods seemed to close in, the fog turning from a misty veil to a dense blanket, filtering the remaining light into an eerie glow. She finally reached the ancient tree, its trunk massive and twisted, branches stretching out like the arms of a ghost. Clara placed her hand against the rough bark, leaning close to listen. At first, there was only the wind, a low, mournful whistle through the leaves. But as she stayed still, the whispers began, soft and indistinct, like the rustling of dry leaves. The words were unintelligible at first, a jumble of sounds that made no sense. Yet as she concentrated, the whispers grew clearer, forming a chilling warning. "Leave, before it finds you." Chilled, Clara stepped back, her breath visible in the cold air. She glanced around, the feeling of being watched creeping over her. The woods had grown darker, the fog thicker, as if reacting to the tree's ominous warning. A sudden rustle from the underbrush sent her heart racing, and she turned to see a shadow moving parallel to her, large and formless, obscured by the fog. Her mind raced with the old stories her grandmother told of spirits and creatures that roamed the woods, guarding their secrets fiercely. Panic set in, and she began to run. Her steps hurried and uneven on the forest floor. Behind her, the rustling grew louder, faster, as if whatever it was had begun to chase her. Branches snagged her clothes, roots tripped her feet, but fear propelled her forward. She dared not look back, imagining only the ghastly form of whatever haunted the woods reaching out for her. The whispering of the tree echoed in her mind, a mantra that fueled her desperate flight. After what seemed like an eternity, Clara burst from the tree line, the lights of her grandmother's house, a beacon in the night. She didn't stop running until she reached the door, slamming it shut behind her, gasping for breath, her body trembling. Her grandmother, roused by the commotion, came quickly to her side. With wide, knowing eyes, she listened to Clara's frantic tale. Sighing deeply, she nodded, a grave look settling over her face. "You ventured too far, child," she said softly, "and you heard what you were not meant to hear. Be thankful it let you leave." That night, Clara lay awake, the whispers of the tree still rustling in her ears, a haunting reminder of the wood's dark depths and the secrets they kept. Never again would she wander so carelessly into the grip of the old woods, nor ignore the ancient warnings spoken by trees that watched through countless cold autumns. The woods were alive, whispering and waiting. Story 8. In the heart of winter, under the relentless watch of a steel-grey sky, Ethan and his sister Eliza set out for a hike through the newly snow-covered trails of Harper's Forest. The forest was known for its sprawling vistas and the old legends whispered by the locals, tales of spirits encased in frost and ice, guarding the solitude of their wooded realm. As they walked, the crunch of their boots on the crisp snow was the only sound in a world muted by the heavy blanket of winter. The air was sharp, biting at their cheeks and noses, turning breaths into swirling mists before their eyes. Ethan, ever the adventurer, led them deeper into the forest, drawn by the thrill of the untamed wild and the purity of the snow-laden landscape. They reached a part of the forest where the trees were particularly dense, old giants cloaked in white, their branches heavy with snow. It was here, amidst the stillness of these ancient sentinels, that Eliza felt a change in the air, a subtle shift that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She grabbed Ethan's arm, her voice a hushed whisper. "Do you feel that?" Ethan paused, looking around. The atmosphere had indeed changed. The earlier calm had been replaced by a pressing silence, one that weighed on their ears almost tangibly. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something dreadful to happen. As they stood there, a chill, deeper than the bite of winter air, swept through the clearing. It wasn't just the cold, it was a presence, something unseen, yet palpably sinister. A soft sound, like the murmur of dry leaves, began to fill the air, growing louder, becoming a whisper that echoed around them in a language they couldn't understand, but felt ominous. Ethan, skeptical yet unnerved, motioned to continue walking when suddenly a series of sharp cracks fractured the silence. They spun around, just in time to see a dark figure darting between the trees, too large and moving too deliberately to be any creature native to these woods. Panic gripped Eliza, and she tugged at Ethan's sleeve, urging him to run. They sprinted through the snow, their breaths ragged, hearts pounding in their chests. Glancing back, Eliza saw it again. The figure, tall and cloaked in darkness, gliding across the snow without a sound, its form blurred but distinctly humanoid. They did not stop running until the forest gave way to the clearing near their car. Only when the doors were locked and the engine hummed beneath Ethan's shaking hands did they dare to breathe a sigh of relief. As they drove away, Eliza looked back at the tree line, half expecting to see the figure emerging from the forest. That night, back in the safety of their home, Ethan and Eliza researched the legends of Harper's Forest. They stumbled upon tales of a forgotten tragedy, where a group of settlers vanished without a trace, swallowed by the forest one cold, dark winter. Locals believed their spirits lingered, lost and angry, guarding the solitude of their frozen tomb. Though Ethan remained skeptical, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that they had encountered something supernatural, a guardian of the forest's darkest secrets. The experience bonded them in a shared certainty. Some places are meant to be left alone, their mysteries too ancient and deep to be disturbed. And Harper's Forest, with its whispering winds and ghostly visages, was one such place. Story 9. Late one autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Carter and Mia ventured into the dense woods of Eldridge Hollow. This forest was infamous among the locals for the unsettling tales that clung to its dark, knotted trees and the shadowy paths that wound through it. Undeterred by the legends, the couple sought the thrill of exploration, their steps eager and filled with an adventurous spirit. As they delved deeper into the woods, the twilight deepened, casting long shadows that danced around them with the rustling leaves. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a reminder of the forest's perpetual renewal. Carter, with a laugh, dismissed the eerie tales as mere superstitions, but Mia's intuition nagged at her, a whispering dread that grew with every step they took into the heart of the forest. Their path led them to an old bridge, arched over a quietly flowing stream that reflected the last embers of the day. It was here, at this seemingly tranquil spot, that the atmosphere shifted palpably. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets and the occasional call of a night bird, suddenly hushed, as if muted by an unseen presence. Mia's voice trembled slightly as she urged Carter to turn back, her eyes scanning the dense thicket that bordered the stream. "Something feels wrong," she whispered, her voice barely above the murmur of the water below. Carter, skeptical yet sensitive to Mia's growing anxiety, agreed to head back. But as they turned to leave, a thick fog began to roll in, swirling around their feet and creeping along the path they had come. The fog seemed unnatural, moving against the slight breeze, enveloping them in a cold, damp blanket that chilled more than their bodies. It seemed to seep into their very souls. They quickened their pace, the fog growing denser, obscuring their vision until they could barely see a few feet ahead. It was then that they heard it, a soft, sorrowful wail that echoed through the trees, a sound both haunting and beckoning. Mia clutched Carter's arm, her eyes wide with fear as the wailing grew closer, a mournful melody that seemed to speak of ancient woes and unending loneliness. The couple stopped, paralyzed, as the silhouette of a figure slowly materialized through the mist. It was draped in what appeared to be a tattered gown, floating inches above the ground, its face obscured by the shadows of the trees. The figure stopped at the edge of the bridge, its head cocked to the side as if examining them. Carter, despite his fear, found his voice, his words cutting through the chilling silence. "Who are you? What do you want?" he demanded, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. The figure remained silent, its presence oppressive, before it slowly drifted closer, the ground beneath it untouched by its form. The air grew colder, and the fog thickened, enveloping the figure until it was just a wisp, disappearing as mysteriously as it had appeared. With the figure gone, the forest sounds gradually returned, the spell of silence broken. Mia and Carter, hearts pounding, wasted no time and hurried back to the safety of their car, the fog dissipating as they left the bridge behind. Once safely away from the forest, they spoke little of what occurred, each lost in their own thoughts, the memory of the encounter lingering like a bad dream. They knew they had stumbled upon something inexplicable, something that perhaps should have remained undiscovered. Eldridge Hollow had lived up to its eerie reputation, leaving them with a story that they would only share in hushed tones, a tale of the sorrowful spirit that guarded its lonely bridge. As they drove away, the fading light of the day seemed to whisper a warning. Some mysteries are too deep, too dark to be explored. Story 10. On a chilly October night, under the deceptive comfort of a crescent moon, Ellie and Tom decided to explore the abandoned ruins of what was once the Willow's End Sanatorium, hidden deep within the Blackwood Forest. Rumored to be haunted by the restless spirits of its former patients, the decrepit building stood as a dark sentinel against the night sky, its windows like hollow eyes watching the world outside. Armed with flashlights and a daring spirit, Ellie and Tom pushed through the overgrown path that led to the sanatorium. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay, and as they stepped inside, the echo of their footsteps reverberated through the empty halls, a stark reminder of the silence that dominated this forsaken place. As they ventured deeper into the building, the weak beams of their flashlights barely cut through the oppressive darkness. The walls, stripped of their paint, were adorned with graffiti that whispered tales of agony and madness, the scribbled words bleeding into the crumbling plaster. In the depths of the sanatorium, they found the remnants of the treatment rooms, where rusted beds and scattered medical instruments spoke of long-forgotten suffering. Ellie, a flicker of fear dancing in her eyes, suggested they record their exploration. For the thrill, she said, her voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. As Tom agreed, they began to narrate their journey into the camera, documenting every eerie detail. It wasn't long before they heard it, a soft, dragging sound that seemed to come from the end of the corridor. Tom raised his flashlight, his hand trembling slightly, casting light toward the sound. Nothing there but the endless stretch of hallway and the peeling paint of doors, long unhinged. They pressed on, curiosity edging out their fear. As they approached the old hydrotherapy pools, the air turned markedly colder, and Ellie's breath became visible, a mist in the beam of her flashlight. The water, stagnant and black, mirrored the darkness above, a dark abyss in the heart of the sanatorium. Suddenly, the surface rippled without cause, as if touched by an invisible hand. Ellie gasped, her heart racing, as the water began to swirl in slow, deliberate patterns. Tom, his voice barely a whisper, urged her to keep filming, though his own fear was palpable. That's when they saw it. Within the watery depths, a shadowy figure appeared, its form distorted and wavering under the fluid surface. It moved as if struggling, the limbs flailing in slow motion, as if reaching for release from its watery prison. Ellie, unable to tear her gaze away, continued to film, her hands now shaking violently. Tom, torn between fascination and terror, muttered a silent prayer, his eyes fixed on the ghastly apparition. Without warning, the figure surged upward, the water erupting around it, and a bone-chilling wail pierced the air, a sound so sorrowful and anguished that it seemed to soak into the very walls of the sanatorium. Ellie screamed, dropping the camera, its lens shattering against the hard, cold floor. In an instant, the figure vanished, the water once again still and silent, as if nothing had disturbed its peace. Ellie and Tom, hearts pounding in their chests, didn't pause to retrieve the camera. They fled through the dark corridors, the echo of their footsteps chased by the haunting cries that seemed to emanate from every shadow. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of their car, the night air feeling warmer in comparison to the cold dread that had enveloped them in the sanatorium. As they drove away, the image of the tormented spirit in the water haunted them,
a stark reminder of the suffering that the walls of Willow's End had absorbed over its many years of existence. Ellie and Tom never returned to Blackwood Forest, and the footage remained lost within the broken camera, buried beneath the waves of that dark pool, a record of their encounter forever sealed away in the depths of the haunted sanatorium.
Story 11. Late one November evening, Sarah and Jack ventured into the heart of Evershade Woods, drawn by legends of a witch said to haunt the ancient forest. They walked beneath towering oaks and twisted pines, their path illuminated only by the faint glow of the half-moon piercing through the dense canopy above. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of decaying leaves and the distant howl of a lone wolf, its mournful cry echoing across the woodland. Sarah, an avid collector of supernatural tales, had convinced Jack to accompany her in search of the Witch's Hollow, a sunken grove where the witch was rumored to perform her dark rituals. As they delved deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches clawing at the sky like gnarled fingers. Every snap of a twig underfoot sounded like a whispered secret, and the further they walked, the more Jack felt the oppressive weight of unseen eyes watching them. Suddenly, Sarah stopped, her hand shooting out to grab Jack's arm. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing ahead where a faint light glimmered between the trees. It was not the steady glow of a lantern, but a flickering, ethereal light that danced like fireflies trying to escape the night. With a mix of excitement and trepidation, they followed the light as it moved deeper into the woods, always just out of reach, always leading them further away from the path they had known. The forest around them grew denser, the trees older, and the air colder with each step. They arrived at a clearing where the moonlight did not reach, shrouded in shadows so thick it seemed to swallow the light from their flashlights. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone altar, its surface worn and covered with moss, and behind it, the figure of a woman, cloaked in black, her face hidden beneath a hood. Jack's breath caught in his throat, and Sarah clutched his hand tighter. The woman began to chant in a language neither of them understood, her voice a melody that was both beautiful and terrifying. Around her, shadows seemed to swirl and twist, forming shapes that were too grotesque to be merely tricks of the light. Frozen in place, they watched as the witch lifted her arms, the shadows rising around her like dark waves. Her chanting grew louder, more urgent. Suddenly, she stopped, her head snapping up to reveal a face so pale it seemed to glow in the darkness, her eyes black voids that promised endless despair. She had seen them. With a shriek that turned the blood in their veins to ice, she pointed a gnarled finger at them, and the shadows surged forward. Sarah and Jack turned to run, stumbling through the underbrush, the witch's laughter ringing in their ears, a sound that was quickly drowned out by the thundering of their own hearts. They did not stop running until they had burst free of the woods, the open sky above them a relief after the claustrophobic darkness. Glancing back, Jack saw nothing but the quiet forest, the witch and her shadows gone as if they had never been. Breathless and disbelieving, they vowed never to return to Evershade Woods. Their search for legends satisfied but forever overshadowed by the night they encountered the Witch of the Hollow. The woods remained, a silent sentinel, harboring secrets too dark for the light of day, and in their dreams, the witch's black eyes followed them, a reminder of the night the forest had almost claimed them. Story 12. In the depths of winter, under a heavy grey sky, Alan and Mia trekked through the newly fallen snow in the sleepy town of Whitmore. They had heard stories of a ghostly procession that appeared on the coldest nights of the year. A spectral march of the damned souls from the forgotten Whitmore Sanatorium closed down decades ago after a mysterious fire. As they approached the ruins, a chilling wind picked up, swirling the snow into ghostly figures that seemed to dance around them. The sanatorium loomed ahead, its charred walls, and broken windows, a stark reminder of the tragedy that had occurred there. Despite the eerie setting, their curiosity pushed them forward, drawn by the thrill of the unknown. The air grew colder as they entered the remains of the building, their breath visible in the frigid air. They explored the decrepit hallways, the silence broken only by the crunch of snow under their boots and the distant howl of the wind. Mia's flashlight beam danced across peeling walls and fallen beams, casting long shadows that seemed to flicker and move of their own accord. As the sky darkened further, Alan noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The air felt charged, a static that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. He grabbed Mia's arm, stopping her. "Do you feel that?" he whispered. Mia nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. They continued to the heart of the sanatorium, the old patient wards where the fire had claimed the most lives. As they entered the main hall, the temperature dropped sharply, their breath now freezing in the air, and a soft whispering filled the room. It was like the murmur of a crowd just out of comprehension, a language of grief and pain whispered by invisible lips. Then they saw them, figures, translucent and shimmering against the dark backdrop of the ruined hall. They moved slowly, a procession of spectral forms bound in ethereal chains, their faces twisted in agony and despair. The figures didn't notice Alan and Mia, instead trudging forward in an eternal march, reliving their last moments over and over. Mia reached out a hand as if to touch one, but Alan pulled her back. The touch of the living to the dead was forbidden in every ghost story he'd ever heard. As they watched, the figures began to fade, the whispering growing softer, until both the vision and the voices disappeared completely, swallowed by the silence of the night. Shaken, Alan and Mia quickly made their way out of the building, the weight of the souls they had witnessed pressing heavily upon them. As they left the threshold of the sanatorium, a final glance back revealed nothing but the quiet, empty ruins. The procession was gone, but the imprint of their presence lingered, a haunting memory that would never quite leave the minds of those who witnessed it. Back in the safety of their warm home, they debated telling their tale, aware that speaking of the dead could invite them closer. In the end, they decided to keep their experience between them, a shared secret that bound them and the spectral marches of Whitmore Sanatorium in a silent pact, unspoken but never forgotten. Story 13. Nestled in the remote village of Ravenshallow, surrounded by dense woods famed for their unexplained phenomena, stood the ancient Milner house. Local legend whispered that every 30 years on the night of the blood moon, the house reawakened with the spirits of those who had mysteriously vanished within its walls. Carla and Tom, intrigued by the tales woven by the villagers, decided to explore the Milner house on such a night, their spirits a mix of skepticism and thrill. As they approached, the house stood silhouetted against the blood-red moon, its windows like dark, watchful eyes. The air was unnaturally still as they entered, the only sound their footsteps echoing on the old wooden floor. The house was a labyrinth of rooms filled with dust-covered furniture and portraits of people whose eyes seemed to follow their every move. As the moon reached its zenith, a cold gust swept through the house, the lights from their flashlights flickering erratically. In the main hall, they found a grand piano, its keys yellowed and worn. Drawn by an inexplicable urge, Carla pressed a key, and a discordant note hung in the air, breaking the oppressive silence. The sound seemed to trigger a shift in the atmosphere. The temperature dropped, and a dense mist began to fill the room, swirling around their feet. From the mist, figures started to materialize, their forms blurry and shifting. These were the spirits of the house's past occupants, trapped in a spectral dance. They moved around Tom and Carla, their faces contorted in silent screams, reliving their last moments of despair. As they navigated through the shifting corridors, the spirits began to become more corporeal, their ghostly hands reaching out faces inches from Carla and Tom's, their icy breaths mingling with the air. Tom pulled Carla away just as a hand almost grasped her arm, its touch promising eternal entrapment. Finally, they found themselves back at the entrance, the door now visible through the thinning mist. They didn't look back as they stepped outside, the door slamming shut behind them with a force that echoed through the night. The couple drove away as the first light of dawn tinged the sky, the Milner house fading into the morning mist, quiet once more, but never truly at rest. They knew they had escaped with more than just their lives. They carried the burden of the house's secrets, a haunting knowledge that would whisper to them in the quiet moments of their lives forevermore. Story 14. In the heart of the forest-covered hills of Elderwood, where tales of the supernatural seemed as common as the leaves on the trees, there stood a forgotten path known only to the oldest maps and the wildest rumors. Here, in the deep seclusion of the woods, there was said to lie the remains of the old Cromwell estate, a place marked by a tragedy so profound that the sorrow seemed to seep into the very soil. Lara and her brother Jason, drawn by the allure of the unknown and the thrill of adventure, decided to uncover the truth behind the stories. They embarked at dusk when the shadows lengthened and the forest seemed to come alive with whispers of the past. The path was overgrown, the brambles like clawing hands trying to hold them back, but they pressed on, driven by a mix of excitement and a creeping dread they couldn't quite shake. As they delved deeper, the trees grew denser, blotting out the sky and casting everything in a perpetual twilight. Finally, the ruins of the Cromwell estate emerged through the mist, its once grand structures now little more than crumbling stones and broken beams. The air was thick with a palpable sense of melancholy. It was as if the estate itself was grieving its long-lost glory. Intrigued and undeterred, Lara and Jason began to explore. They traversed what had once been lavish gardens, now wild and untamed, as if nature itself was attempting to bury the past. In the heart of the estate, they found a decrepit fountain, its waters still and murky, reflecting the last slivers of dying light. As night fully took hold, the wind began to howl through the ruins, carrying with it the faint sounds of a piano playing somewhere within the labyrinth of broken walls and shadows. Following the sound, they came upon an old music room, the piano intact amidst the decay. Lara, compelled by a force she couldn't understand, sat at the piano and began to play. With each note, the atmosphere shifted, the wind grew colder, and the darkness seemed to press in closer. Shadows moved at the edge of their vision, shapes and forms that were human-like yet distorted, as if trapped between worlds. The music summoned the spirits bound to the estate, phantoms of the Cromwell family, each replaying their last moments, caught in a loop of their final night when fire and betrayal had led to their demise. The apparitions danced in a silent masquerade around them, their faces twisted in expressions of horror and despair. Overwhelmed and frightened, Lara stopped playing, and the spirits vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. The siblings quickly gathered themselves, their hearts pounding, the eerie music still echoing in their ears. As they made their way back through the forest, the weight of what they had witnessed hung over them like a dark cloud. They knew they had touched something ancient and sorrowful, a piece of history forever lost to pain and regret. They emerged from the woods at dawn, the first light of day casting long shadows behind them, a chilling reminder of the night when they walked with ghosts. They left the path behind, never to return, the haunting melody of the piano lingering in their minds, a spectral lullaby that would never quite let them forget. Story 15. In the chill of late October, when the leaves had turned to whispers of gold and the air promised the swift approach of winter, a local legend drew 5 friends into the depths of the Harrowick Woods. The legend spoke of the witch's circle, a clearing where the trees bent away as if in fear, and where it was said a coven had once summoned something they could not control. Eager for a thrill, and perhaps to debunk the myths for their podcast on local legends, the group set out just before midnight. Led by Tom, who carried a bulky camera and an even bulkier sense of skepticism, the friends ventured deeper into the woods under the pale light of a crescent moon. As they approached the rumored location, the forest seemed to tighten around them, the branches intertwining above to form a dark canopy that starlight could not penetrate. The path, muddied by recent rains, squelched under their boots, each step a cold, wet reminder of the approaching winter. Suddenly, they stepped into the clearing. It was eerily perfect, a perfect circle with not a single weed growing out of place, and the trees around its edge looked like silent sentinels. In the center, a stone altar, worn and weathered, stood as a testament to the tales that had brought them here. The air grew perceptibly colder as they set up their equipment, their breaths visible in the ghostly light. Tom, ever the skeptic, joked about the lack of spectral hosts to welcome them, but his laughter was hollow, lost in the vast silence of the woods. Deciding to conduct a seance, they gathered around the altar. Hesera, whose grandmother had dabbled in the esoteric arts, led the ritual, her voice a soft chant that seemed to stir the air itself. As her words rose in a crescendo, a wind whipped through the clearing, the trees groaning under its sudden fury. Then, silence fell so heavy it was almost a physical presence. The temperature dropped, breaths turning to frost before their eyes, and a dense fog rolled over them, obscuring their vision. From the mist, figures began to emerge, shapes of what appeared to be women, their forms blurry and shifting, faces obscured by a timeless grief. The camera, forgotten in the chaos, continued to roll, its lens capturing the faint outlines of the spectral women as they moved closer. The air filled with whispers, words in a language long forgotten, spoken with a desperation that chilled the soul. Panicked, the group scrambled to break the circle, stumbling through the fog, which seemed to cling to them like cold hands. As they broke free, the temperature returned to normal, the fog dissipating as swiftly as it had appeared. Back in the safety of their cars, hearts still pounding, they reviewed the footage. The camera had captured more than just fog. There were faces in the mist, expressions twisted in agony and rage, a stark warning against those who would intrude upon their eternal sorrow. The witch's circle remained undisturbed after that night. The friends, once eager for supernatural encounters, now avoided heroic woods. The memory of that night, a haunting melody that whispered through their dreams, a reminder of the night they had called to the past, and the past had answered with a vengeance. Story 16. Late November brought with it a biting wind that swept through the sleepy town of Eldridge, cloaking it in an early dusk that seemed eager to erase the boundaries between the known and the unknown. It was on such an evening that Mark, a seasoned hunter, ventured into the dense forest that bordered the town, driven by tales of a beast that lurked within, a creature of folklore, known only as the Blackwood Stalker. Armed with little more than his trusty rifle and a headlamp, Mark entered the forest with a mix of skepticism and thrill. The trees, stripped of their leaves, formed skeletal silhouettes against the steel-grey sky, their branches clawing at the air as if to warn him back. As the sky darkened, the forest seemed to close in around him, each step taking him deeper into a world where the line between myth and reality was as thin as the crescent moon above. The wind carried a low howl, a sound that could have been the wind through the branches, or something far more sinister. Mark set up a makeshift camp near an old, gnarled oak that seemed almost to watch him with a hollowed-out knot that resembled an unblinking eye. As he warmed his hands over a small fire, the crackling of the flames mingled with the rustling of the leaves, a symphony of the natural world at night. But then another sound cut through the night, a heavy, dragging gait, like something large moving with a limp. Gripping his rifle, Mark shone his headlamp in the direction of the noise. At first he saw nothing but the dense thicket, but then the light caught two gleaming eyes, low to the ground, reflecting back at him like twin orbs of coal. The creature, obscured by shadow, was larger than any bear he'd known, its breaths coming in heavy rasps that fogged the chilly air. Frozen in place, Mark's hunter instincts kicked in. He aimed his rifle, his finger hesitating on the trigger, his heart pounding in his ears. But as he watched, the creature slowly, painfully, dragged itself into a clearing, illuminated by the moonlight. What he saw then was not a monster, but a wounded deer, its body grotesquely misshapen, as if it had been the victim of a cruel twist of nature. Lowering his weapon, Mark approached the deer with caution. It watched him, its eyes filled with a wild, desperate fear, but it could not move to flee. Close up, he could see that its injuries were severe, too severe for the forest to heal. With a heavy heart, Mark did what he came to do, though not in the way he had anticipated. A single shot echoed through the blackwood, a sound swallowed immediately by the encroaching silence. Mark left the forest that night with the weight of the encounter heavy on his shoulders. The blackwood stalker, he realized, was no monster to be hunted, but a creature as vulnerable as any other, a living being bound to the cycle of life and death in the shadowy depths of the woods. The town's tales, born of fear and the unknown, had led him to expect a beast, but instead he found a reminder of the fragility hidden beneath the canopy of fear and myth. As we come to the end of our time together, let's take a moment to unwind and prepare for a restful sleep. Take a deep breath in, hold it for a moment, and let it out slowly, releasing the day's stresses and worries. Feel your body beginning to relax as you sink deeper into comfort. Imagine a wave of tranquility washing over you, from the tips of your toes to the top of your head. Each breath you take brings you closer to a peaceful slumber. Thank you for sharing this moment with me. As you drift off to sleep, remember that you are worthy of rest, and each new day brings fresh opportunities. Close your eyes, let go, and let sleep come naturally.